March 1st, 1954, Washington, D.C. The United States Capitol hums with routine. Papers shuffling, low voices, the heavy calm of government at work. 4 Puerto Rican nationalists walk into the U.S. House of Representatives, up through the corridors, past the armed guards who barely glance at visitors, into the cool air of the gallery above the chamber. She is at the front of this story, Lolita Lebrón. Hat and gloves, a small purse held close, a folded flag inside. Beside her move her compatriots, Rafael Cancel Miranda, Irving Flores Rodriguez, and Andres Figueroa Cordero. They take their seats like any other spectator, but nothing about this moment is ordinary. Lolita steadies herself, a prayer under her breath, a handwritten note prepared for this day. The purpose is clear: to make the question of Puerto Rico's freedom impossible to ignore. Below them, the chamber stretches wide, desks in regimented rows, sunlight cutting through the high windows. The sergeant at arms maintains order. Members speak, confer, turn pages. It is an everyday scene that does not know it's about to become history. Lolita rises. The fabric moves first. From her purse, the Puerto Rican flag unfurls in a bright flare of red, white, and blue against the marble and brass. She lifts it high so the whole chamber can see. And then, her voice, sharp, unwavering, carries across the well of the house. Viva Puerto Rico Libre. The words ricochet off stone and wood. They are accusation, prayer, and proclamation all at once. A shot cracks in the air, hers, fired upwards from the gallery. Plaster dust drifts like ash. In the same heartbeat, the men move. Rafael draws and aims over the rail. Irving, focus. Andres, steady. Muzzle flashes strobe the chamber. Wood splinters, glass erupts. Lawmakers duck and scatter. Pages dive beneath desks. A gavel hammers with no hope of restoring order. The smell of burnt powder rolls across the floor. A white shirt blossoms red at the shoulder. Another man clutches his side and collapses behind the desk. Papers take flight, spinning like startled birds. Panic has a sound. Heels scraping marble. Shouted warnings. The metallic ring of a drop pen skittering across tile. 5 congressmen are hit. Stunned faces. Shocked hands pressed to sudden wounds. The human cost of a message fired into the heart of American power. Above them, the gallery is a storm of arms and urgency. Seconds stretch into a lifetime. Security surges. Members themselves, some brave, some furious, rush towards the stairs. One man tries to get a line of sight. Another shouts for help. The gallery rail shakes as bodies collide. Rafael wrestles as someone grabs his arms. Irving's wrist is pinned. Andres is dragged down in a tangle. The guns go quiet. The echo does not. Through it all, Lolita does not flee. She stands with the flag, composed, almost serene in the chaos. To be seen, to be named. Her act is not hidden in smoke. It is present, deliberate, defiant. The flag's edges ripple in the disturbed air while the chamber below swarms with fear and fury, with triage and shouting, with the shock of history forced in the day's agenda. Capitol Police swarm the gallery. Hands seize shoulders and wrists. The arrested are marched away. Rafael, Irving, Andres, pulled toward the stairwell, faces set, bodies bruised. Lolita steps forward to surrender. Cameras find her. Even in that instant, she is escorted down the long corridors, the flag still in her grip, its colors trailing like a signature. The building seems to inhale and holds its breath, trying to comprehend what has happened inside its walls. Outside, sirens bite into the afternoon. Inside, the floor of the house is a grid of urgency. Coats pressed to bleeding. Medics calling for space. Officials shouting orders. The narrative will be wrestled over for years. Terrorists or freedom fighters, criminal outrage or the desperate thrust of a colonized people demanding to be seen. But whatever the label, the fact is unblinking. In less than a minute, Puerto Rico's demand for self-determination was carved into the American memory. I do not romanticize blood on marble. I do not ignore the bodies carried on stretchers or the fear on a staffer's eyes as she helps a wounded man breathe through the pain. But I refuse to flatten Lolita Lebrón into one headline. She was a woman who chose a public act of rebellion inside the very seat of federal power, knowing exactly what it would cost. She raised a flag where no one expected to see it, and for a charged, irreversible moment, the chamber had to look. History doesn't always knock. Sometimes it forces the door. This is Act 1, the explosion of a question that had been politely shelved, made visible by a woman with a flag and 3 men by her side, by shots that shattered glass and certainly in equal measure, by the sight of a nation's colors raised where they were never meant to fly. I am Dyron Castro-Torres, the genealogist, and this is Lolita Lebrón, Rebellion, Resistance, and Lineage. Dolores Lolita Lebrón Soto was born on November 10, 1919 in Lares, Puerto Rico, the daughter of Gonzalo Lebrón and Rafaela Soto Luciano, paternal granddaughter of Felicita Lebrón Pitre and maternal granddaughter of Manuel Jesus Soto and Juana Luciano. She grew up on coffee country soil, where her father worked as a foreman, a working-class household that prized discipline, dignity, and devotion. Though Gonzalo was skeptical of religion, Lolita embraced the Catholic faith as an adolescent and kept it as a compass for the rest of her life. Like many islanders seeking wages and a wider horizon, she migrated to New York City in 1941, finding work in the garment trades and encountering discrimination that sharpened her sense of Puerto Rico's colonial condition. In New York, she connected with the Puerto Rican nationalist movement, eventually rising within its ranks. The arc from Lares to the mainland's class experience, faith, and migration, the personal roots of a public life. On March 1st, 1954, Lebrón led Rafael Cancel Miranda, Irving Flores Rodriguez, and Andres Figueroa Cordero into the visitors gallery of the U.S. House of Representatives, unfurled the Puerto Rican flag, and fired into the chamber, wounding 5 congressmen. She was convicted on federal charges. The court imposed a decades-long sentence, up to 50 years in her case. Lebrón served 25 years in federal prison, refusing parole conditioned on contrition. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter commuted the sentences of Lebrón, Cancel, and Flores. Figueroa had been released earlier on humanitarian grounds. Lebrón returned to Puerto Rico and continued her activism, publicly renouncing armed struggle and embracing civil disobedience. Late in life, she stood again at the front of a cause, the island-wide effort to end the U.S. Navy bombing in Vieques. Arrested in 2001 for trespassing during a base protest, she received a 60-day sentence, a stark bookend to a life lived at the cost of liberty for the principle of liberation. Lolita Lebrón died on August 1st, 2010 in San Juan, Puerto Rico at 90 years old, remembered by her supporters as a symbol of Puerto Rican self-determination and by critics as the face of an unforgivable act. Both views attest to her force, a daughter of Lares whose convictions never yielded. To understand her resolve, we must now turn to the household that formed her, to her father, Gonzalo Lebrón, whose example set the first link in Lolita's chain. Lares, Puerto Rico, May 30th, 1890. The civil registrar opens his book at 8 in the morning and writes the name that will one day lead us to Lolita's story, Gonzalo Lebrón. In the left margin, there's a single word that changes everything, natural. Not a character note, a legal category. This is a birth act from the Spanish-era civil registration. It tells us that a child was born in Lares, that he is recorded under his mother's surname, and that no father is named. Hijo natural signals what the page refuses to say out loud. Gonzalo arrived outside of marriage, without a recognized father present to claim him before the registrar. In the 1890s, that meant he carried only his mother's surname, and any second surname, any hint of paternal lineage, would have to come later by recognition, legitimization, or rumor that hardened into the custom. For a genealogist, this is the moment that paper trails splits. The record is clear enough to anchor a life, place, date, status, and mother named, and yet it withholds the very clue we need to unlock Lolita Lebrón's paternal line. This is why natural is in both a wall and the key. His mother, Felicita Lebrón, a native of Lares, is the informant on the record, and she is the daughter of Simón Lebrón and Matilde Pitre. This single page does not give us a father, but it gives us time, place, and status, and with those three coordinates, we can move forward to our next clue. Let's see if we could use our genealogical skills to find exactly who his father was. Lares, June 16, 1917. The registrar opens with a formula, but the ink carries a life. Gonzalo Lebrón, single resident of Lares, appears to legalize what the church has already blessed. At his side stands Rafaela Soto Luciano. The record fixes them in time and place. Lares, Puerto Rico, a hillside town that has sent countless couples through these very same doors. Then, the line that matters for genealogy. Gonzalo is recorded as hijo natural. The civil page again withholds his father's name and anchors him under his mother's surname alone. 25 years after his birth, the status remains unchanged. Rafaela's side is fuller. The entry names her parents. She is the recognized daughter of Manuel Jesus Soto and Juana Luciano. Why this page matters? It confirms identity continuity for Gonzalo from 1890 to 1917. It locates the household we need to follow, and it hands us a jurisdiction to mine. It also gives us a clock. Within 2 years of this act, in 1919, Gonzalo and Rafaela will welcome a daughter in Lares, the name that would echo across history, Dolores Lolita Lebrón. The record gives us a wedding and a web of places. It also gives us an empty space where the father's name should be. That silence is our next map. And that's when I turn to our next document, looking for the first hint of who stood behind the silence. Lares, Puerto Rico, January 24th, 1920. The 1920 U.S. Census opens like a map. I scan the grid, column by column, until a familiar household locks into place. Gonzalo as head, Rafaela Soto Luciano as wife, and an infant, Dolores, our Lolita, counted just weeks after her November birthday. The enumerator didn't just tally, he listened. He records Gonzalo with 2 surnames, Bernal y Lebrón. That first surname didn't appear in his 1890 birth or his 1917 marriage, but here's where the community's memory slips into a federal form. That's our first clue, Bernal. Then the deeper hit, buried in the birthplace columns. For Gonzalo, the line listing his father's birthplace is marked as Spain. On this single page, the census gives us a double lead. The father carried the surname Bernal, and he was born in Spain. 1 word in a name box, 1 word in a column. Together, they advance our search. This matters. A census is a secondary evidence, but it captures how people identify themselves in real time. If neighbors, clerks, or Gonzalo himself reported Bernal, and if the enumerator was confident enough to write Spain for the father, then somewhere in the record trail there should be an echo for the Bernal clan. The rest of the page anchors the context. Coffee country occupations, Puerto Rican births across the household, a young family fixed in Lares at the dawn of 1920. That tells me where to drill. Lares and the neighboring towns for Bernal men of Spanish origin. Any notarial books, acknowledgements, or legitimizations that could explain how a hijo natural began to be known by two surnames. 2 clues, 1 page, Bernal and Spain. Now, the hunt narrows from a mountain of possibilities to a corridor with a name on the door. And that's when I pulled the next record, hoping the whisper would turn into a signature. Lares, March 10th, 1906. In the Civil Book of Deaths, the secretary records the declaration made at 11 in the morning. The informant stands and gives his name, Juan Bautista Lebrón Pitre, vecino of Lares. He states, formally, solemnly, that his sister, Felicita Lebrón Pitre, had died. The wording follows in the Spanish civil style. Juan Bautista, manifestado que su hermana, Felicita Lebrón Pitre. It fixes time and place of death, notes that she died in her own home, and identifies her as natural de San Sebastián. Then comes the line every genealogist hopes to see in a death act, que era hija legítima de Simón Lebrón and Matilde Pitre, natural de San Sebastián. With one sentence, the record anchors Felicita to both parents and to a birthplace, San Sebastián, sending us straight into the Lebrón and Pitre families in the island's northwest flank. For our story, this page is more than just a death notice. It confirms that the woman we know as Gonzalo's mother, the same Gonzalo recorded as hijo natural in 1890, is the legitimate daughter of Simón Lebrón and Matilde Pitre. But the most valuable detail today is the informant himself. Civil registries often reveal kinship through the person who steps forward to report the death. Here, the informant is not a neighbor or a son. It's Felicita's brother, Juan Bautista Lebrón Pitre. His presence places a second Lebrón Pitre adult in Lares in 1906, close enough to the household to sign and clarify the facts. Remember him, Juan Bautista Lebrón Pitre. I'm going to need that name for the next record. And that's when I opened the following entry, hoping it would turn our clues into proof. Lares, Puerto Rico, May 12, 1910. The 1910 U.S. Census lays out a neighborhood line by line, and one name stops me cold. Agustín Bernal y Toledo. The schedule calls him a widower. His place of birth, Spain, and the columns for his father and mother also read Spain. In the occupation fields, he appears as a working man in the coffee industry, everything we are looking for that surrounds Gonzalo's later life. In his household lives his daughter, written as Maria S. Bernal y Torres. The S stands for Socorro. I want you to remember her name. Some names in these records have a way of reappearing. Now, look one line over, the neighbor. It's Juan Bautista Lebrón Pitre, the same Juan Bautista who reported the 1906 death of his sister, Felicita Lebrón Pitre, Gonzalo's mother. Side-by-side households, a Spanish-born Bernal and the Lebrón Pitre family. Geography is testimony. The proximity principle is a kind of witness. Put this against what we already know. In 1920, Gonzalo is enumerated as Bernal Lebrón, and the census says his father was born in Spain. Here, in 1910, a Spanish-born Bernal sit next door to Gonzalo's maternal uncle. Name, origin, and neighborhood. All 3 boxes are checked. It doesn't yet say father on the page, but the census has narrowed the corridor to a single door. Agustín Bernal y Toledo. What comes next is I'm gonna hunt for any place where Maria Socorro Bernal y Torres or Agustín himself appears. One signature is all it takes to move this from compelling to confirmed. And that's where the next record is put to the test. Lares, Puerto Rico, January 6th and 7th, 1920. I turned the census page, and there she is again. Maria Socorro Bernal y Torres, now the head of household. And on the very next line, the enumerator writes the word that matters the most in the relationship to the head of household column, hermano, and gives us the man's full name as Juan Lebrón y Bernal. For anyone new to Puerto Rican naming, this is a masterclass in one glance. Maria Socorro Bernal y Torres means father, Bernal, mother, Torres. Juan Lebrón y Bernal means father, Bernal, mother, Lebrón, because he was illegitimate. He used first Lebrón, second Bernal. If they are listed as brother and sister in the same home, the census is telling us that they share a Bernal father, and that this Bernal had children with a woman whose name was Lebrón. That single pairing fits the exact pattern we've been tracking since Gonzalo's 1890 birth as hijo natural and his 1920 entry as Bernal y Lebrón, with a father born in Spain. Now, stitch the neighborhood together. In 1910, we saw Agustín Bernal y Toledo, a widower, Spanish-born, living with his daughter, Maria Socorro. 10 years later, Maria Socorro is the head of household, and her brother, Juan Lebrón Bernal, is under her roof. Meanwhile, just across another 1920 page, Gonzalo appears as Bernal Lebrón, with the census explicitly marking his father's birthplace as Spain. Name, origin, and kinship are all converging. The household proves the core fact we needed. Agustín Bernal lived in Lares and fathered at least one child with a Lebrón woman. That is the structural beam under our hypothesis about Gonzalo's paternity. It also gives us two living guideposts to chase on paper: Maria Socorro and Juan Lebrón Bernal. The grid has finally stopped whispering and started speaking plainly. Now I know which files to pull, which signatures to hunt, and which names to circle in the margins. And that's when I reach for the next document, where a single line promises to write the father's name in ink. Utuado, Puerto Rico, May 5th, 1955. The death record of Francisco Lebrón, born in Lares about the early 1890s. Then there, the line every genealogist hunts for: parents, Agustín Bernal and Felicita Lebrón. The form gives us more than a name drop. It preserves the relationship of Agustín Bernal and Felicita Lebrón as co-parents. When a son says his father's parents were Bernal and Lebrón, that is direct, inside the house testimony. Now watch the pieces lock. In 1890, Gonzalo appears as hijo natural, no father named. In 1917, his marriage repeats the silence. In 1920, Gonzalo is enumerated as Bernal Lebrón, and the census marks his father's birthplace as Spain. In 1910, Agustín Bernal y Toledo, a widower from Spain, lives with his daughter, Maria Socorro Bernal y Torres, and besides his neighbor, Juan Bautista Lebrón Pitre, Gonzalo's maternal uncle. In 1920, Maria Socorro Bernal y Torres heads the household with her brother, Juan Lebrón y Bernal, proof that Bernal fathered children with a Lebrón woman. And here, this 1955 certificate states outright that Francisco Lebrón, born in Lares, within just a couple years of Gonzalo and Juan Lebrón y Bernal, was the son of Agustín Bernal and Felicita Lebrón. Same town, same generation, same maternal surname, same Bernal father from Spain. When independent lines converge this tightly, the case is no longer speculation, it's structure. With this document, I can say it plainly. Gonzalo Lebrón, Lolita's father, belongs to the same sibling set as Francisco Lebrón and Juan Bernal y Lebrón, children of Agustín Bernal y Toledo and Felicita Lebrón Pitre. The civil record finally says what the neighborhood has been saying all along. And that's when I turned the page to trace Agustín Bernal himself, because every father leaves a trail. Tenerife, Canary Islands, Spain. The priest notes a child baptized on February 5th, 1829, and gives him the name Juan Agustín. The entry states he is the son of Don Agustín Bernal, natural of San Miguel Abona, and Doña Rosalia Toledo, likewise of San Miguel. It names paternal grandparents, Don Antonio José Bernal and Doña Maria Betancourt, and maternal grandparents, Don Gregorio Toledo and Doña Maria González. For our case, this single page locks the Spanish origin we've been tracing. Agustín Bernal y Toledo is not just Spain on a census column. He is a Canario, from San Miguel de Abona, Tenerife, with both parents identified. Then, I noticed the crucial surname in the paternal line, Betancourt, commonly known as Betancourt. That word opens a door 5 centuries wide. A quick frame for viewers. Jean de Betancourt, 1362 to 1425, was a Norman nobleman who led the early 1400s conquest and colonization of parts of the Canary Islands. Recognized as Lord of the Canaries under Castilian authority, he returned to France and died in 1425. Jean left no children. His successor in island rights was his nephew, Maquiat de Betancourt, and Maquiat is the one who left numerous descendants across the archipelago, sending the Betancourt surname into Canarian families for generations. So what does Augustine's baptism tell us about our Lolita Lebrón? If Augustine's paternal grandmother is Maria Betancourt, then Lolita's paternal line carries the Betancourt blood that proliferated in the Canaries after Maquiat. While we will still document the chain, person by person, the historical pattern means Lolita is likely a descendant of Maquiat Betancourt, not Jean, through the widespread Betancourt lines in Tenerife. A birthplace, 4 grandparents, and 1 surname with 500 years of history. That's how a thin ink line in Tenerife widens into a family saga that reaches Lares and eventually the US capital. And that's when I turned to the next record to follow Agustin from Tenerife to Puerto Rico, step by step. Lares, 1900. The heading is unmistakable. Declaración de Nacionalidad. This is the form every Spanish-born resident in Puerto Rico had to sign if he wished to remain a Spanish subject after 1898. And the signature at the bottom says it all. Agustín, Bernal y Toledo. Line by line, the declaration fixes his identity into law. He gives his birthplace as San Miguel de Abona, Tenerife, Canary Islands, and states his residence as Lares. He declares himself a subject of the King of Spain, choosing Spain over the new U.S. nationality established on the island. The clerk asks for his parents' names, and Agustin supplies them, then signs the page in a steady hand, A. Bernal, before the municipal judge as a witness. On the right margin, a priceless detail appears, a list of his children, among them Maria Socorro, the same daughter we saw in 1910 and 1920 censuses. That cross-document continuity matters. It ties the Spanish-born Bernal y Toledo directly to the Bernal household in Lares, where Maria Socorro appears. Why this paper is a cornerstone? It proves origin. Agustin is a Canario from San Miguel de Abona, matching the baptism we just read. It proves presence. He was physically in Lares in 1900, exactly where our Lebrón line stands. It proves family connections. The children's list Maria Socorro and her siblings to this Agustin, letting us link the Bernal and Lebrón households that surround Gonzalo. And it captures his legal choice in the wake of empire. Context for a Spanish immigrant who had fathered Puerto Rican children bearing both Bernal and Lebrón surnames. In other words, the nationality book doesn't just say who Agustin was. It plants him in time, place, and family, right where our evidence needed him to be. And that's when I turned to the next document, following this Canarian signature as it threads through Lares and into Lolita Lebrón's story. Lares, June 24th, 1916. The death of Agustin Bernal y Toledo, 88 years old, agricultor, natural de España, resident of Lares. The doctor's note gives us the cause, senilidad, and the civil clerk writes what life has already decided. Agustin was a widower. The parents are named again. Father, Agustin Bernal, mother, Rosa Toledo, both born in Spain. The spelling drifts from Rosa to Rosalia, but the structure holds, matching the San Miguel de Abona Tenerife baptism we just read. The record also lists the surviving legitimate children, and among them is the one whose names we've been following through the census pages, Socorro. The same family web, now under the final seal. For genealogy, this page is a lock on 4 points at once. Identity: Agustín Bernal y Toledo, the Spanish-born patriarch of Lares. Parentage: Bernal plus Toledo repeated, consistent with his Canarian baptism. Place: Lares, the very neighborhood where the Lebrón Pitre kin lived door to door. Progeny: Socorro, whose half-siblings, whose surnames Bernal y Torres, Bernal y Lebrón, and Lebrón y Bernal proved that Bernal fathered children with a Lebrón woman. Taken together with the 1910 and 1920 censuses and the 1955 death certificate of Francisco Lebrón, this act closes the circle. Lolita Lebrón's father, Gonzalo Lebrón, belongs to the children of Agustín Bernal y Toledo and Felicita Lebrón Pitre, a Canarian-Puerto Rican union written across parish, civil, and federal ink. With the Bernal trial now sealed, we turn the page back to Lolita's maternal grandparents, the roots that anchored Rafaela Soto herself, Manuel Jesús de Soto, and Juana Luciano of San Sebastián del Pepino. And that's where the next document takes us. Camuy, Puerto Rico, August 2nd, 1923. At 8 in the morning, the civil registrar records the death of Juana Luciano Oslán, maternal grandmother of our Lolita Lebrón. The declarant appears, gives the particulars, and the clerk fills each box with the names that matter most to a family historian. Juana is identified as married to Manuel Jesús de Soto, a vital anchor that ties this entry to the Soto Luciano household we've been following from Lares to the north coast. Then, the page opens the next layer. Juana's parents are named as Pedro Luciano and Dolores Oslán. The clerk keeps going, this time to the generation most death records never reach. Juana's paternal grandparents are listed as Pedro Luciano and Estefania Rivera. Her maternal grandparents, Pedro Oslán and Maria Lopez. For a genealogist, this is a jackpot in a single act. 3 ascending tiers. Parents and both sets of grandparents, all in one legal statement. It locks in Manuel Jesús de Soto as the spouse, whose records can corroborate them as parents of Rosalia Soto, mother of Lolita. With this act, Lolita's maternal branch stops being a silhouette and becomes a chart we can walk, entry by entry. Most important for our next move, the mention of Pedro Luciano. We secured Juana's identity, her marriage, her parents, and all 4 grandparents. 4 doors opening at once. Now, we will follow the line of Pedro Luciano. Camuy, Puerto Rico, May 7th, 1895. The civil book of deaths opens on Pedro Luciano Rivera. The clerk fixes the essentials. Age, 45. Natural and resident of Camuy. Married. And then names the spouse who anchors this branch, Dolores Oslán. The act closes by listing a roster of his children by name, including Juana, living at the time of his passing. For genealogy, the page does 2 things at once. First, it confirms the marital unit we've been following, Pedro Luciano and Dolores Oslán, and preserves their children as a ready-made checklist for parish searches. Second, it shows the limits of any single document. No parents are mentioned for Pedro. If this was our only source, the line would stall here. But we don't work from one page. In Juana Luciano Oslán's 1923 death record, the clerk explicitly identified her parents as Pedro Luciano and Dolores Oslán, and then reached another generation back to Pedro Luciano and Estefania Rivera. That cross document explains why this act's second surname, Rivera, matters. It preserves the maternal line of Pedro's father, our Estefania Rivera, right into Pedro's identity. There's one more reason to keep our pencils sharp. Names tend to flex in the records. The next document will show that Pedro Luciano the Elder also appears under another given name, Felix, a common switch in 19th century Puerto Rico where people used baptismal middle, or familiar names interchangeably. So I'm gonna follow that clue, because if Pedro is also Felix Luciano, the parish and civil books may be fuller than they first appear. And that's when I open the next record, where Pedro is also called Felix. Lares, October 30th, 1916. The civil book records the death of Gregoria Luciano Oslán, full sister of Juana, Lolita's maternal grandmother. The entry is blunt and generous with names. Gregoria is the daughter of Pedro Luciano and Dolores Oslán. Her paternal grandparents are written as Felix Luciano and Estefania Rivera. Her maternal grandparents, Jose Oslán and Maria Lopez. Why this matters? It confirms the same grandparent set we saw in Juana's record, and crucially shows Pedro Luciano appears in the books as Felix Luciano. Different documents, same family, now aligned. And that's when I turn to the next document. Camuy, Puerto Rico, February 6, 1897. This birth act names a newborn Pedro Nolazo Luciano. The declarant is his father, Juan Luciano, and the clerk adds the line I wanted. The child is the grandson of Felix Luciano. And, crucially, the grandparents are written with both surnames, Felix Luciano Acosta and Estefania Rivera Ocasio. One more gift hides in the margin of detail. Felix's birthplace is Cabo Rojo. Why this matters? Even without a standalone record for Felix Luciano, this entry fixes 1. His double surname, and 2. His town of origin. In Puerto Rico's naming system, that points straight at his parents, a Luciano father and an Acosta mother. If we can locate a marriage in Cabo Rojo in the early 1800s, a Luciano man and an Acosta woman, the odds are overwhelming we've identified Felix's parents, because those surnames are uncommon together in that parish at this time. This single baptismal ripple gives us a place and a pair of surnames to lock the generation above Felix Luciano. And that's when I turned south to Cabo Rojo, hunting a marriage line that will put their names, finally, on the page. Cabo Rojo, Puerto Rico, June 8th, 1807. In the parish index, meticulously transcribed by Dr. Ursula Acosta, Dr. David Stark, and Anna Maggie Romanillos, one entry jumps off the page: the marriage of Esteban Luciano, son of Francisco Luciano and Rosalia Linares, to Felipa Acosta, daughter of Felipe Acosta and Antonia Rodriguez. For our case, this is the needle we needed. In the late 18th, early 19th century Cabo Rojo books, this is the only Luciano Acosta marriage. Pair that with our Camuy birth record naming Felix Luciano Acosta and stating Cabo Rojo as his birthplace, and the pattern locks: a Luciano father plus an Acosta mother in this parish at this time. The simplest, evidence-driven conclusion is that Esteban Luciano and Felipa Acosta are the parents behind the double surname Felix Luciano Acosta, the same Felix we traced as Pedro Felix Luciano, grandfather of Juana and Gregoria. One line in Cabo Rojo, one line in Camuy. Together, they close a century-wide loop and push Lolita Lebrón ancestry deep into the southwest coast. And that's when I turn to the next clue, following the Luciano Acosta line to see where it first takes root. Villa de San Germán, February 22nd, 1762. The priest records a marriage that lights up our Acosta thread. Felix Acosta, legitimate son of Ayudante Josef Acosta and Anastasia Colon, weds Maria Rodriguez, legitimate daughter of Domingo Rodriguez and Tomasa Colon. The entry notes a marital dispensation granted on the third and fourth degree of consanguinity, almost certainly through the Colon lines shared by both mothers. For our tree, two details hit like a stamp. First, the groom's given name appears as Felix, confirming the fluid usage we see later and explaining why a grandson could bear the same name. Second, when we set this 1762 act besides the 1807 Cabo Rojo marriage, Esteban Luciano to Felipa Acosta, daughter of Felipe Acosta, the pattern tightens. Felipa's father, Felipe, is the earlier Felix Felipe Acosta, and her son becomes Felix Luciano Acosta, almost certainly named after his maternal grandfather. Name transmission, place continuity, and the Colón kin network all align. This record also pulls our Acosta Colón axis a generation deeper. Josef Acosta plus Anastasia Colón and Domingo Rodriguez plus Tomasa Colón, setting up parish searches for other records that could better inform us. And that's when I turned to the next document. Cabo Rojo, Puerto Rico, Parish Death Index, 1781 to 1821, transcribed by Ana Maggie Romanillos, Eunice Irizarry Christy Dimas, and Maria Socorro Rivera. 2 entries close the circle on our Rodriguez-Colón line. First, November 7th, 1785, Domingo Rodriguez, 70 years old, receives full funeral rites. The entry names his wife as Tomasa Colón Luciano, the double surname that ties her to the Colón clan we've been tracking. Then, August 28, 1790, Tomasa Luciano, wife of Domingo Rodriguez, died at about 70 years old. For our tree, these paired deaths confirm the elders named in the 1762 marriage of Felix Felipe Acosta and Maria Rodriguez, Domingo Rodriguez, and Tomasa Colón, placing them firmly in Cabo Rojo. And that's when I turned to try to find the parents of Tomasa Colón Luciano. Cabo Rojo, Puerto Rico, January 7th, 1783. In the same parish death index, I find Maria Colón, about 80 years old, buried with double rites. The line that matters most reads, Esposa de Juan Luciano. Then comes the roll call of children, including Tomasa, fixing Maria as the matriarch of the Luciano Colón household. For our tree, this page does 2 things in one breath. It confirms Tomasa Colón among Maria's children, the same Tomasa Colón Luciano who appears as the wife of Domingo Rodriguez in the 1785-1790 entries, and it locks in the generation above Felipa Acosta's mother, Maria Rodriguez, giving us the Colón backbone that later feeds into Felix Luciano Acosta, then Pedro Luciano, then Juana Luciano Oslán, then Rafaela Soto Luciano, and finally Lolita Lebrón. With Maria Colón's death, our paper trail for this branch reaches its natural end in the late 18th century. But if you follow my work, you know that the Colón families of Puerto Rico are documented as descended from the House of Colón, Christopher Columbus's own family. This page stands at the threshold of that older lineage. And with that, we close the ledger on this ancestral line and turn the page to carry Lolita Lebrón's roots back to her life and legacy. On March 1st, 1954, shots cracked the calm of Congress. 5 men fell wounded, the chamber froze, and Lolita Lebrón stood still beneath a flag, refusing to run. The courts answered with decades in prison. She served 25 years, won clemency in 1979, returned home, renounced violence, and kept marching, Vieques among her final stands, until her death in 2010. History calls her many names. The record preserves the facts. A woman raised a flag. A nation was forced to look, and a paper trail proved she carried centuries of history in her blood. I am Dyron Castro Torres, the genealogist, and this is just the beginning.